Now, for our last entertainment, we are in England in 1836, back with Charles Dickens, the man who more than anybody revived the roaring customs of Christmas. He was aided and abetted, of course, by Queen Victoria's Prince Albert, you know, who, being a German, introduced the Christmas tree into Britain and also popularized the Christmas card. But Dickens was the man who brought back to Christmas the deafening goodwill that had been banned by the Puritans of the English Civil War. Now, we're not going as a tribute to him to read over any of his Christmas stories, because we figure that you may be wanting to read them yourself in the next few days. What we're going to do is to perform for you one of the great trials of literature, which was written by Dickens at the age of 23. This is the Dickens that everybody thinks of, with the lines and the beard, the Dickens of his prime. But this is the Dickens who wrote the Pickwick Papers, and that's what we're going to show you. A newspaperman, a court reporter, the fastest shorthand writer in the House of Commons. That was the extent of his fame until he wrote this book, which contains this trial. The trial of Mr. Pickwick. You will see the cast headed by Sir Cedric Hardwicke as the judge and Mr. Francis Sullivan as Sergeant Buzfuz. Now, let me tell you the circumstances of this very sad case. They're very simple. Mr. Pickwick had lodgings with a widow called Mrs. Bardell, and he decided to hire himself a valet. And one morning he went rather nervously to Mrs. Bardell and wondered whether it would be more expensive to keep two people than one. She took this for a proposal of marriage, fainted in his arms. His friends and traveling companions walked in, leaving Mr. Pickwick with no words to say at all. 3 months later, he was speechless when he received a letter from her lawyers suing him for breach of promise of marriage. Now I think the court's assembling. Let's take a look in there and see what's happening. Now you see there the defendant, Pickwick, in the middle there with his two lawyers, Sergeant Snubbin and Mr. Funky. And there we're coming over to, oh, here she comes. This is the plaintiff, Mrs. Bardell, and supported by Buzfuz, Sergeant Buzfuz, the great prosecutor of the day, with his ambitious assistant standing up there. And there is the usher. They're ready to begin now.
All right. Silence in the court! Silence in court! Silence in court! Silence in court! Bardell and Pickwick.
I am for the plaintiff, my lord.
Who is with you, Brother Buzfuz?
Mr. Skimpy, my lord.
I appear for the defendant, my lord.
Anybody with you, Brother Snubbin?
Mr. Funky, my lord.
Sergeant Buzfuz and Mr. Skimpton for the plaintiff. For the defendant, Sergeant Snubbin and Mr. Monkey.
Beg pardon, your lordship, Funky.
I'm sorry, I've not had the pleasure of hearing the gentleman's name before. Very good. You may go on.
Silence in the court! Silence in court! Silence in court! Silence in court!
You may proceed, Sergeant Buzfuz.
Never, in the whole of my professional experience, never since the first hour that I started the study and the practice of the law, have I approached a case with deeper emotion, or with a greater sense of the responsibility that has been imposed upon me. A responsibility which I dare to say I should have found it difficult to accept, but for the fact that I am certain that my oppressed client will find the claim that she makes granted by this intelligent and high-minded 12 gentlemen that I see in the jury box before me. This is an action for a breach of promise of marriage. The plaintiff is a widow. The late Mr. Bardell, after enjoying the confidence and esteem of his sovereign for many years, glided almost imperceptibly from this world.
He was knocked on the head with a beer mug in the cellar of a saloon.
Glided, I say, almost imperceptibly perceptibly from this world. But he stamped his likeness on a little boy, sometime before he died, of course. With this little boy, Mrs. Bartle retreated from the world to the tranquility of her home in Goswell Street. And here she placed in her front parlor window a placard or sign. I wish to call the particular attention of the jury to the wording of this sign. Apartments furnished for a single gentleman, inquire within. Now, why should Mrs. Bartle advertise for a single gentleman? Because, gentlemen, she had no distrust, no fear, no suspicion of single gentlemen. Mr. Bartle had once been a single gentleman himself. To single gentlemen she looked for protection. In single gentlemen she would always be reminded of her lost husband. To a single gentleman, then, said this trusting lady, shall my lodgings be let? Did the sign remain there long? It did not. The serpent was on the watch. The train was late. Before the sign had been in the window 3 days, gentlemen, a being appeared, erect upon 2 legs, bearing all the outward semblance of a man, and not of a monster. This gentleman, he knocked at the door, and it was the defendant Pickwick. Now, of this man Pickwick, I shall say little. The subject has few attractions. But if the defendant be in court, and I am informed he is, let me warn him that neither this counsel nor this high-minded jury will accept any attempt to put them down or intimidate them or bully them. And any attempt to do either or either will recoil upon the attempter, be his name Pickwick, or Snickwick, or Dokes, or Stokes, or Sykes, or Brown, or Thompson.
Silence in court! Silence in court! Silence in court!
For 2 years, Pickwick continued to reside at Mrs. Bartle's house. And during all this time, she looked after him, attended to his needs, cooked his meals, darned his socks. I shall prove to you that on many occasions he gave pennies to her little boy. And on one occasion he patted the boy on the head and made use of this remarkable expression: "How should you like to have another father?" I shall prove to you, gentlemen, that about a year ago Pickwick suddenly started to absent himself at home, as if he wished to break with my client. On one occasion, however, when he returned from the country, I can prove that he definitely proposed marriage to the lady, taking care, of course, that there should be no witnesses of the solemn contract. And I shall prove to you that on that morning he was seen holding the plaintiff in his arms, soothing her agitation with his caresses. And now, gentlemen, one word more. 2 letters have passed between the parties. Have these letters been open, fervent, eloquent epistles? They have not. They are underhanded and sly, intending to delude any third party into whose hands they might fall. Now let me read you the first. Garraway's, 12 o'clock. Dear Mrs. B, chops and tomato sauce. Yours, Pickwick. Chops? Gracious heaven! And tomato sauce. The next has no date whatsoever, which in itself is suspicious. Dear Mrs. B, I shall not be at home until tomorrow. Slow coach. And then follows this remarkable expression. Don't trouble yourself about the warming pan. Gentlemen, is the happiness of a sensitive woman to be thrown lightly aside by chops, tomato sauce? Why is Mrs. Bardell requested not to agitate herself about a warming pan? Unless indeed it be a cover for hidden fire? And what is his allusion to a slow coach? For all I know, it may be a reference to Mr. Pickwick himself, who has behaved like a criminally slow coach in the whole of this transaction. But enough of this, gentlemen. It is difficult to smile with an aching heart. Now, consider this ruined mother. The placard is down, but there is no tenant within. Eligible single gentlemen pass and repass, but they do not inquire within or without. All is gloom and silence. The mother weeps. The little boy is still at his childish toy. At Pickwick, the ruthless destroyer of this domestic oasis in the desert of Goswell Street. Pickwick, with his chops and tomato sauce and his warming pans, he still rears his unblushing head. Damages, gentlemen, heavy damages are the only punishment you can visit upon it. And it is for those damages that my client now asks of this high-minded, dispassionate, intelligent jury of her civilized fellow countrymen. Call Elizabeth Tuppence.
Elizabeth Tuppence!
Elizabeth Tuppence!
Elizabeth Jupkins!
Elizabeth Muffin.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mrs. Gubbins, do you recollect being in Mrs. Bardell's upstairs back room on a day one morning, July last, when she was dusting Pickwick's apartment?
Yes, my lord and jury, I do.
What were you doing in the back room, ma'am?
My lord and jury, I will not deceive you.
You had better not.
I was there unbeknown to Mrs. Bardell. I'd just been out to buy 3 pounds of potatoes when I seen Mrs. Bardell's door on the jar.
On the what?
Partly open, my lord.
She said on the jar.
It's all the same, my lord.
Pray proceed, ma'am.
I just walked in, gentlemen, to say good morning when I heard the sound of voices in the front room.
You listened, I believe.
Oh, begging your pardon, sir, I would scorn the action. The voices forced themselves upon my ear.
Well, was one of these voices Pickwick's?
Yes, it was.
Well, tell us in your own words what happened.
Well, sir, there was voices and all, and Mr. Pickwick asked her if she thought it cost more to keep 2 people than 1. And I distinctly heard Mrs. Bardell say she thought she'd be a very happy woman.
Mm-hmm. And then what?
Well, then there was a state of consternation, sir. Mrs. Bardell let out a sort of moan, and 3 other gentlemen went into the room, and the little boy started hollering and howling. But Mr. Pickwick come out, leading Mrs. Bardell round the waist downstairs.
Thank you, Mrs. Cuppins. I think that will be ample.
Sergeant Snubbin.
No questions, my lord. The defendant is prepared to concede that the witness's version is substantially correct.